Tate Chronicles now transmitting.
Welcome to the Tate Chronicles on Healthcare Now Radio. And now, here's your host, Jim Tate.
Good day, citizens of the free world, from border to border, coast to coast, and to all the ships at sea, I bring you a warm welcome. This is your correspondent, Jim Tate, and thank you for tuning into the Tate Chronicles. Join me as we cut through the fog that exists at the leading edge of healthcare technology. I'm really pleased to welcome an associate I've known for a few years, Mr. Christopher Leonard. For years, Chris has been at the leading edge of healthcare development technology as well as artificial intelligence. In fact, his master's thesis was on healthcare informatics and AI. Chris, thanks for joining the Tate Chronicles today.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, Chris, AI has been in the background for years in the healthcare domain, but really in the last 6 months has it burst into the mainstream as far as visibility. It's almost like a gold rush. The popularity of applications like ChatGPT and others have created an environment where AI is considered the next big thing. So I'm looking forward to talking and getting your thoughts on it. But before we dig into that a little bit, tell us a little bit about your background and your experience in healthcare and data in specific.
Absolutely. I mentioned I've known Jim for some time. He's worked with us with a lot of the meaningful use work, and he's a very knowledgeable, great partner. So it's nice to
thank you.
Be here.
It's been a long and winding road keeping up with regulatory and compliance issues.
Exactly, and we started, I think, around 2010, right when meaningful use was taken off. So that was what 13 hymns ago,
right? Yeah.
So anyway, I'm a physician, healthcare executive. I'd say a clinical informaticist too. I was a CIO for a physician management company, 300 plus clinicians in the long-term care space, wound care specifically. So it was niche based, but I was CIO for 7 years and informatics director for 5 years prior. And for a year prior to that, I worked in the field doing wound care in long-term care facilities. And that overlapped 2 to 3 years of clinical work I did after my general surgery residency. So I did general surgery, but I always had an interest in wound care and related areas. But I specifically came to corporate in 2010, and specifically liked the development and the creativity that was involved there, and the challenge of healthcare at that time. That was the beginning of the real collision of healthcare and technology and EHRs and mandates and federal programs. And they existed before, but this really was when it was on steroids. So I redesigned the proprietary EHR and it was niche specific. We had smart data capture, and we expanded the care model and added verticals that the EHR supported and other systems within the ecosystem. So it was really a privilege to be able to work on that sort of thing and expand the care model, aligned with CMS initiatives as well. And ultimately, with all that data capture, we moved into data transformation across the whole enterprise, and then subsequently predictive analysis in addition to descriptive analysis. So we were using a live AI model that fed back into the EHR, which and that was what the thesis was about. So I did a master's at Northwestern Healthcare Informatics while I was CIO. So it's kind of like doing a residency where you're studying and you're doing what you're studying. So that was very fortunate for me to be able to do that. But that's about 2022.
You know, Chris, I talked to a lot of folks about AI and a lot of folks about healthcare. So I love talking to somebody who's been in actual healthcare delivery, as well as directly involved with the technologies around that delivery. So for those of us who may not be up on it quite as much in terms of AI definitions, we keep hearing of predictive AI and generative AI. What's the difference between those two, and how does that possibly apply to healthcare?
That's a great question. It's important to make that distinction because otherwise it gets muddier than it might already be. I think generative AI is no pun intended, but predictively going to be more stealing the limelight with standalone AI tools or application. Several years ago, maybe 2016, 17, there was a bump in the attention given to predictive AI. But I think that the predictive AI largely, with some exceptions, there are some standalone applications that have, kind of cool predictive functionalities that are easy to remember. But a lot of predictive AI, I think the best predictive AI works in the background and is transparent. So it's not readily identifiable. And it captures lots of different data from different sources, and the models are trained on data in order to make predictions. So, like potential diagnoses, potential risk assessments, cost analysis, things like that. So it's not always as sexy. With generative AI, the difference in a generative at a high level and a generative AI model is a generative AI is creating novel content. So it basically is attempting to, for lack of a better term, mimic the ability to create content. So if you think of predictive AI as sort of putting in all of the variables about a given patient that are relevant in the examination, and the prediction or the output is the diagnosis. And then ultimately it learns how to look at these different variables and the correlations between them, but on a massive scale, and weight them differently, and then make predictions and recommendations and treatment recommendations, things like that, or risk assessments. Whereas generative AI is really more about the learning, the model learns how to take content and various types of texts rather, realistic images, summaries of topical knowledge,
Sure.
and out,
Chat. Yeah,
all
chat.
sort of,
Sure, Chat GPT, which are pretty.
exactly.
Yeah, like predicting the next word. And those models can be trained. Let's talk about a couple of use cases. I was at the HIMSS conference. I don't know if you were there a few months back, Chris, but every EHR claimed they were doing AI, and they're trying to make it as visible as possible. And quite a few of them, even very small vendors, basically be using Chat GPT to look at data on a patient and maybe generate a diet plan or an exercise plan, something like that. That's kind of one interesting, but certainly that does not have the power of AI to maybe look at radiographic images and scans, which is highly being used. But what are your thoughts about? But this, I tell you, Chris, this kind of reminds me a little bit of when the first driverless, or I guess they call them driverless cars, came out. They seem to work really well 99% of the time, or maybe more. But sometimes it didn't work, and so with radiographic use cases, or maybe use cases where a treatment plan is suggested or labs are ordered, it seems almost imperative that there be some human review of actions before they're taken, or diagnoses, kind of to confirm. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's going to be true for quite some time, and even in an ongoing way. So one of the things, and that's true of predictive and generative AI. So predictive AI, because it's predicting a variable or diagnosis, whatever it's predicting or whatever it's recommending. There's something called the black box concept, and it's an FDA approval gets involved in this as well. You have to document how you're coming up with these predictions and these recommendations, because in healthcare specifically, it can't be a black box where it's not decipherable by a human in terms of what the attributes are, or what how you're arriving at a conclusion or how the model is.
Sure.
With generative AI, I think in some cases it seems a little less serious because you're creating emails or maybe small marketing campaigns. But when you start to now take that and apply it to healthcare, and not just for logistics, appointments and reminders and patient portals and things like that, but if you are looking at it for education, for the patient to be reading about their medicines or being able to inquire about one of their medicines related to a condition that they have, it's really important to get that right, of course. Otherwise, there can be quite a mess. So there is a black box component there as well. The reason also that generative AI can explode the way it does is because with predictive, you need to find your data set, which needs to be very clean, and that's not very easy. And then you have to build the models from scratch. The proprietary algorithms, you still have to build the model from scratch. It takes a lot of time and effort to get it to find the level of predictability, the accuracy, which is formally tested. With generative, there's still some questions as to how to measure its accuracy. What is accuracy when you're creating content? It's very contextual. So one of the reasons that it explodes is because you don't have to make it from scratch. You're using an engine that's already built and you're just applying it to more narrow scoped content rather than generalized content from the entire, across different sectors or topics. So when you apply it, you have to train it properly and you have to understand, you have to be able to look at it and understand what the target is for your level of comfort with it. And that's going to be an ongoing thing. There are some standardized methods, but there is a lot of subjectivity to it because it is content, it's language and context. So there's always going to be that level of subjectivity. And if things change, the model has to change and the interactions have to change because if you change the process or the logistics or the context of anything, then a lot of times the output is going to change. So there's this thing called drift, and that's going to happen with generative AI, just like with predictive AI. So yeah, I think we're going to learn as we go. There are a lot of people concerned with copyright infringement, things like that. Is something authentically created or and that sort of thing. So and that happens in the music industry and writing industry and all those things too. But in terms of medicine, I think the place for generative AI, the safest place is routine operational tasks and basic patient education and information, so you can smooth out the process until it gets a little more seasoned and proven to where you can put it into places where decisions are going to depend on it.
Let me mention to our audience, if you're just joining us, I'm Jim Tate. On this episode of the Tate Chronicles, I'm speaking with Chris Leonard, and the topic is AI in the healthcare domain. Chris, one of the things I always like to discuss and hear commentary on has to do, particularly with AI, the barriers to implementation and acceptance of the technology. This is a pretty big step forward. Most providers who've used EHRs are used to clinical decision support rules, and alerts may pop up and things like that, kind of a crude AI maybe. What's it going to take for the acceptance of this technology? Is just that the proof over time that it's safe? Or, are we at version 1.0 of this? And, it's changing so rapidly that the risk of using it is not considered an issue for providers. Where are we at with that?
I think in the blanket of healthcare, there will be some time before that's adopted. But that's why it's also important to keep generative and predictive separate. Predictive was it had some high barriers to succumb. And largely those were internal for the people developing or the enterprise developing because of the the lack of ability to determine ROI as easily as it was for routine development. Routine development, if you're building something that just does a certain function, you know what that function is, and you know what that function is probably worth. With model prediction, with model development, it's not just a one and done. Typically, it's building an infrastructure that runs in parallel. So there's quite an investment, and plus the skill sets were sort of unknown. Who do I need to build these, and how do we prioritize the different models that we're going to pump out? It makes much more sense to create models, more than one, to have AI work in terms of increasing your operational efficiency internally, or in the case of healthcare, also increasing clinical efficacy or quality of care. Those things, they also require, depending on what they do, at some FDA approval. There are some recommendations, but there's quite an investment, and it's a long game. And on top of that, you really have to have good standardized data. So if you haven't really conquered the digital transformation that we all talk about, you really don't have the ammunition to have a really good functional and accurate product in a predictive AI scenario. If you're trying to use your own data with generative AI, you're taking the guts of something and basically applying it to information within your niche. So as long as that information is accurate, and as long as the contextual output is appropriate, it's going to be largely safe, and especially if you're using it for operational purposes. But I think that's why there's sort of a difference between the two, and that's why digital transformation still has to continue, because for everyone, obviously, we need to convert. But I think that actually generative AI will probably lead the way for more digital transformation. And the reason being is that generative AI is sort of an interface to explain different outcomes, measures, different information that is evolving and always. And we're always learning more data insights from predictive tools. Yes. So predictive tools are going to, they're going to produce a lot of output. And as you run them, and as they're used, and as you measure their accuracy and their predictive value, you're going to learn things like which dressings, for instance, in wound care, which dressings are best used in given scenarios. And you're going to finally have data on a large scale that you didn't have before. So you're going to unlock data insights. So there's basically what's called knowledge discovery, and knowledge discovery it occurs in, like I said, a non-sexy way. However, if you're now going to allow clinicians to use generative AI, like a lightweight generative AI model in their EHR, where they can type a question about a given scenario, or some of those data insights within your niche, now there's extra incentive to get those produced and get them actually utilized. So it's not just payers and risk identifiers looking at them, but it's actually end users and patients, and especially with patients, to give them the education they need, which is very much a priority of a lot of these federal programs, and rightfully so. I think that you're going to see generative AI push the way forward and accelerate predictive AI, but at minimum accelerate the digital transformation process that's kind of hit a stall, I think.
One of the things you've mentioned a couple of times has to do with data quality. So if these AI models are trained on giant data sets of clinical records, the identified clinical records, or whatever the data set is, in some cases, because of the fragmentation of our system, if you look like the medications that somebody is on, there may be a medication for diabetes, and that is often almost assumed then, well, they're diabetic, even though it may have been ordered off-label for weight loss, is pretty common right now. And so you're talking about, continued learning. So, in some ways, in the case I just mentioned, the systems have to be sophisticated enough or learn enough that just because somebody's on a diabetic drug, they might not have diabetes. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, that kind of goes back to your concept of clean data, which we don't
Yeah.
always have. We don't always have.
We don't always have, and we're lucky if we do. Obviously, in a narrow niche, it's a little easier. There's a narrow, a more narrow scope. So sometimes it's better to attack it from that perspective. Look at specialty specialty scopes, and then work out from there. I think if you follow federal guidelines, that's probably ultimately in the long term, if you're looking at AI overall across the country, and world, I assume, you're really looking at following the ontology and standardization codification guidelines in some of these federal private program and partnerships. There are innumerable scenarios in which that are not intuitively thought of by many people, even clinicians, that would screw up the ability of a predictive tool to make a recommendation. Incorrect documentation, duplicate documentation, like you said, medications not falling off or being used. So that context and that ability to understand it, it all comes back to context and process. So the way you can defeat that, it's not just about, it is about disparate information and certain types of information. And, if an enterprise as an M&A and they have several products within an ecosystem that have different, languages, different ways of production of the data, you have to be able to understand how the data was captured. So from the point of inception of the data all the way to the point that it's being used by the model needs to be understood. And I think that's a critical point. That's what I learned over my time as CIO. There was, I had to understand the granular nature of the data capture process. And I found that if you make the workflow, the clinical workflow at the user EHR, let's say EHR or any other related system, if you make that streamlined and intuitive, the more likely you are to get accurate data entry. And then certain things you have to mandate, but certain things are going to be likely more accurate and likely not have missing data if you ask for the information at the right point in the workflow. So some of those things, it's very hard to go for a short period of time and watch a clinician and figure this out. These are things that, for 6 years of residency, I probably crammed 15 years of experience in 6 years of residency. And when you do things that frequently, that often, there's a thought process that becomes second nature. And it's that thought process that you have to sort of tap into. And that there are just certain things in the context of providing clinical care at the ground level that other people just aren't going to know. So to leverage that experiential knowledge and understanding, and then combine it with process and logistics and understanding data science enough for data capture and informatics principles, those kinds of things really, really impact the quality of the data more than you hear about. Usually it's about disparate systems, and that certainly is true. But even without a disparate system, there are so many ways that data can be misinterpreted, misconstrued, mislabeled, misunderstood, that it's very critical to have a subject matter expert with experiential knowledge, plus a knowledge of how to translate that into a working system. So I think it's something that often, streamlining workflow is often talked about for efficiency.
Correct.
But it also very, very much reflects data consistency and accuracy.
Chris, it's hard to believe, but we're almost totally out of time. And before we have to say goodbye to our audience, how can our listeners contact you to find out more about your work and what you're involved with. I know you're on LinkedIn. Is that the best place to reach you, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's probably the easiest. The URL is linkedin.com/in/cleonard007. You can look up Christopher Leonard, DOMHI, Masters of Health Informatics. If you put that at the end, then it'll come right up. And then I think Jim's going to put some links on the.
Yeah,
on the.
Absolutely. Well, to our audience, thanks for joining me on this episode of the Tate Chronicles. Of course, I offer a special salute to my guest today, Chris Leonard. Chris, thanks for coming aboard today.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. It was a pleasure.
I've enjoyed it also. You can find more information on this show's program page at healthcarenowradio.com. That's healthcarenowradio.com. Until we meet again, here's wishing you smooth sailing and safe harbors.
Tate Chronicles transmission ending now.